So joining us on the stage, our moderator, who's standing behind me, is John Rogers, who's a professor here in the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. And joining John is Dr. Eugene Garcia, Professor Emeritus at ASU, Dr. Sylvia Rousseau, Professor of Clinical Education at USC, and Dr. David Kirp, who's a professor of the Graduate School at UC Berkeley and a New York Times contributor. Welcome, John, and thank you for moderating today's conversation.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here with this wonderful panel to develop further these ideas of what a policy framework needs to look like to support whole children and whole communities. And as the senator was saying, how we think about a politics that can emerge that will support that sort of policy framework. So let me begin with Dr. Garcia. If you could speak a little bit about what sorts of policy changes are necessary to support the potential of English learners.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. Nice visiting from both Arizona. It's always good to come back. And I can actually say buenas tardes to you all here. Spanish is now legal in California, thanks to Proposition 58. 70% of you said, it's okay to be bilingual. Isn't that wonderful? Wasn't like that about 10 or 15 years ago when I was at Berkeley. So congratulations to you all for recognizing the significance of languages other than English in California. Clearly, the population of students who come to school not speaking English have been a focus of policy for now 60 years. So thanks to Lau versus Nichols in the San Francisco area, and then other judicial decisions, along with civil rights movement, the proposition that these students must be treated differently has been significant over the 60 years. So policy counts for these kids. It's important to understand that demography also counts. They are now a significant population, not just in California, but nationally. About 26% of moms who gave birth to babies in 2016 spoke a language other than English in the United States. Many of those moms will essentially teach their children their primary language first before they ever think about learning English. Most significantly is that those children are all over the United States. A recent report by the National Academy of Science at least identifies that probably no teacher in the United States will have the privilege of not teaching a child who comes to them who does not speak English. So it is everywhere, including Arkansas, where the greatest growth has been in the Southeast in the United States. However, it's important to point out that these kids are also citizens. Over 90% of children under the age of 6 who speak a language other than English were born in the United States. They're not immigrants. Their parents may be immigrants, one or two of their parents may be immigrants, but they're not. They're U.S. citizens. So policy has a particular impact on our citizens. We don't need to debate whether they're aliens or immigrants or undocumented. They're citizens. And we have responsibility for our citizens outside of debates about whether we have responsibilities for others. What are some of the policy issues then that confront these kids? One is one that California faced, the nation faced, is well, we can't speak anything to them besides English because they need to learn it as quickly as possible. Scientific evidence suggests that learning a language other than English before you confront English in a place called school is actually pretty helpful. And going on to take care of the native language while they learn English is also helpful. It produces a better student, overall well-being, and family engagement. So all those things that we've talked about this morning and this afternoon, we need to worry about policies that essentially restrict educators from essentially speaking and supporting that native language. And in many cases, prohibit families and discourages families from speaking that language. It's actually quite enriching to speak a language other than English before you learn English. So leaving that very clear. Very also important to understand that every child has a capacity to learn 2 languages. So the policy really that relates to English learners is only to those kids, but everybody can learn another language. Clearly, some states and some cities essentially developing dual language programs. So there are policies now driving the fact that all kids should learn another language. If we want to reimagine education with regard to languages, everybody should have access to it. Can your brain handle it? Yeah, it can. It's amazing. It can handle it. It can handle it when you're little. It can handle it when you're old. It can do all of that. Brain architecture, no problem. In fact, dual language learners, bilinguals' brain architecture generates some advantages. Besides dealing with Alzheimer's, it generates better executive function in young children. It organizes, it helps them organize their. So policies that restrict access to the native language, that don't allow bilingualism to flourish for all children, is problematic. Policy lever that's also significant to this population is how we prepare and support teachers. We all have certain credentials that people have to have, et cetera. And clearly, if we don't have individuals in the workforce who can handle kids who do not speak English, there's a problem. We do survey after survey that indicates this is an area teachers continue to say, I'm not as prepared as I should be. Policies essentially that allow us, like ESSA now, allows professional development in this area. Do districts and schools do it? Not clear, but the policy's there. Supporting, preparing teachers is absolutely critical. One other one, if I could, and that is, as the superintendent of Miami said so eloquently this morning, we need to invest in early childhood education. What helps the dual language learners, English learners the most, is starting early and supporting that language, supporting that native language, introducing them to English in a context that worries about the whole child. Early childhood educators do not educate children. They work with the whole circumstances of that child. We heard yesterday in a forum here that relationships are important. Dual language learners and early childhood educators know about social-emotional development, about relations, about understanding differences, about dealing with diversity. We can do that very well when kids are young. For dual language learners, your own data in California, the transitional K evaluation by SRI suggests dual language learners age 4 going to kindergarten who get dual language programs in early childhood do very, very well in getting prepared for kindergarten. Those are the policy initiatives that I think are significant for this population.
So thank you, Dr. Garcia. In a moment when national policy and policy discourse too often is dehumanizing and focuses on exclusion, Dr. Garcia's comments remind us that policy also can be about inclusion and validating the ideas that we want to uphold. Let me turn to Dr. Kirp, who has been studying schools around the country that are enacting some of this whole children, whole community approach. And if you can speak a little bit about the difference that these schools make and what sorts of policies these stories tell us we need to enact this in a more systemic way.
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I don't have to tell you that if you pick up the newspaper or listen to radio or TV or read online, is this on? Oh, okay. How about that? Is that better? Yeah. Okay, sorry. So it's all bad news bears, right, out there, basically. You get the scandals, you get the violence, you get all those kinds of things. I mean, the bottom line message is the public schools are broken and they're unfixable. And what you need is charter schools, vouchers, whatever. Those of you who come from Los Angeles, I don't have to tell you about how much money, how many millions of dollars were spent in the last school board campaign to persuade voters that that was the case, persuade them successfully. I spent a lot of time in the schools themselves. I've been lucky enough was lucky enough to spend a year embedded, I guess that's the right word, in a poor Latino immigrant school district called Union City, New Jersey. It's about 5 miles and a light year away from New York City, from Manhattan. And more recently, as someone who's writing a fair amount for the New York Times, I get to find interesting places to go to and hold them up as success stories. And I will tell you this about the New York Times. You send an email to somebody, and before the ink is dry on that email, they've responded. I mean, people are willing to engage in that. And my hope always is, when I write about places, that they use the hell out of them, that they lift up those stories. I think the reason that the pieces that I write wind up being in the top 5, top 10 most emailed pieces is that readers care about education. They like stories. The 7 most irresistible words in the English language are, let me tell you a story. Works for 6-year-olds, works for 85-year-olds, right? And there's some evidence behind these. I'm a policy guy. So they're not just good stories, they're stories with context. So let me tell you a bit about these 2 communities and the larger message. I can really speak to both of them together. Union City, poor Latino immigrant town, the most crowded place in the state, not because they're big, high buildings, but because you've got a lot of families living 4 or 5 in one room, locked door, a shelf in the refrigerator. They're mostly immigrant families. The guess is that about 1/3 of them are undocumented. The language at home is Spanish, not English. It's the telenovela, and football, not football, that's going to be watched. Those are the places which, as Eugene was suggesting, are often the places, where kids get effectively wastebasketed. And so the reason you should pay attention to Union City is those kids graduate at rates higher than the national average, and 75% of them go on to college. And those that don't have really good training in a whole array of vocations at the school. Now, the reason you should pay attention to Union, Oklahoma, which is right next to Tulsa. Some of you have heard about Tulsa's really good preschools and the data that show the long-term positive effects of early education. But Union was a white middle-class suburb, and then about 10, 15 years ago, white middle-class families started moving out, and poor and immigrant families started moving in. So the graduation rate 15 years ago was about 80%. The graduation rate now, 70% free and reduced price lunch, again, families mostly speaking English, is 95%. So you get the point, right? These are places that are, quote, defying the demographic odds. That is, they really are capitalizing on kids' desire to learn and communities' willingness to be supportive. And while there are differences between these places, and I have endless stories to tell you about them, which I'm not going to have time to do, the key is building a system of support, a system based on relationships. Nobody who's asked, what was the biggest influence on your life? People are going to say, may say a teacher. They're not going to say a computer program, I don't think. They're going to think about a teacher that they had. So that system of support begins with really good early education. 2 years in New Jersey, mandated by the court. A year mostly in the public schools in Tulsa that the legislature adopted. A really rich language-soaked curriculum. You just are drenched in language, and for the non-English speaking kids, they follow that precept that you start with the native language and you work slowly to build competence in that language, because we know that if you don't really learn your language, you never are going to be totally comfortable in any language. So they transition to English. In both places, teachers get a lot of support. They get support from other teachers. They get support from coaches. They don't send their teachers off to, I don't know how many teachers there are in the room, a lot, I would guess. You go off to those conferences, they're called spray and pray, right? Think about it. These are folks, these are coaches who come into the classroom and work with the teacher, and it's kind of watch one, do one, teach one. A lot of these teachers who need help at the outset wind up being the folks who are coaching other teachers. They test those kids a lot, and in a way that the quote reformers, and by the way, I tell this to my students, if there's a new issue, claim that word reform, because it's not a neutral word. You know, it's now been, right, it's now, we've lost it. That's why we're in the transforming business. So they use those tests to figure out where there are problems. Problems the kids are having, problems the teachers are having. Classically, folks who teach in the public schools know one of the things the kids have the hardest time with are word problems in math. So, okay, how do you teach word problems in math? So you coach the teachers, and if there are a bunch of kids who are having problems, then you work with those kids. You don't punish the teachers. I mean, you know Ms. Jones is doing better or worse this year than she was last year. You know that Ms. Jones is doing less well than Ms. Chavez, you know, or Mr. Enriquez. And you work with them, and you get those teachers to work with each other. The parents and the community are deeply involved. In Union, Oklahoma, before they'd ever heard the word community schools, they realized that they now had a population of newcomers who had no reason to trust the Anglo school system that existed. So they started by adding health clinics to the schools that were going to be open to everybody. Wow, that was a big deal, because now parents had some place to go for themselves and a place they could drop off their kids. And slowly, they build schools that are open, you know, early in the day to sunset. They're open on Saturdays. They started with the schools that needed the most support. They worked when they figured that they were working, they worked their way out to the entire school system. And then they heard there's something called community schools. Not a new idea, by the way. And indeed, very few of the ideas we're talking about are new. Right? I mean, we're just recycling stuff and giving it, you know, deeper learning. You know, deeper learning meets John Dewey. It's the same. It's really the same stuff, rebranded. You know, this is the project-based learning, the hands-on, all that stuff. Right? This is not new stuff. In Union City, every place is a parent liaison. Often it's a political appointee, a kind of hack. There you've got someone who knows all of the parents, all the families, and knows, you know, how do I get on the housing roster? How do I get a job? You can help with that. You need a winter coat. And if the kid doesn't come to school, they call those families. You've got strong leadership that's setting an example. It's high expectations. It's, and I use the word abrazos, embraces, to talk about Union City. In Union, Oklahoma, the superintendent said, my God, look at this. We just lost 180 kids this year from before they graduated. Does anybody know what's going on with John Smith or Mary Jones or you know, Bobby Hernandez or whoever? And nobody did. It was just an embarrassing moment. And so you get the superintendent and these folks going door to door to find out what's happening. And that's why you get the kind of graduation rate that you do. You get parents engaged. That's not, the good news, as I say, is none of this is new. Any educator with a pulse is going to know this. Nobody's going to disagree with any of what I've said. The bad news is that you got to keep doing it, and you got to keep doing it better. All this continuous improvement stuff is, you got to be looking around and figure out where are we, you know, what can we adopt, what can we do better, where can we learn from what it is that we're doing. And you've got to have stability. You've got to find good leadership and embrace it and support it and build it and train the next generation of leaders. We're a really impatient country. The average superintendent in an urban school district lasts fewer than 3 years. I don't care if you're a genius administrator. You can't change. You can't affect in a serious way. You barely find the bathroom, you know, and where the bodies are buried by the time you're either out there looking for a job or they're out there looking for the next miracle worker who's going to kind of, it doesn't work that way. So one of your tasks, our tasks, is to find those folks who are willing to be system builders, because that's what we're talking about. And that means supporting teachers. It means supporting, you know, principals. It means connecting to the community. And ultimately, it means people who believe in a very basic precept around which you need to build a system, which is that every child deserves what you'd want for a child that you love. Thank you.
Thank you. To underscore Dr. Kirp's point that these ideas are not new, I could bring us back 20 years ago to a school that enacted the sort of whole child, whole community vision that's been articulated throughout the day, and it was the school led by Dr. Sylvia Rousseau in the late 1990s, Santa Monica High School. And you can see she's got lots of fans. Since she was a principal there, she went on to be a associate superintendent and then a clinical professor of education. So she has insight both from the school level and the district level about how we conceptualize policies that can make this sort of schooling systemic. Dr. Rousseau, can you offer us some insights on how we can move in that direction?
Thank you. I'll offer them. Let's see how thank you. This question of transforming schools is really, it's huge, and I've given it a lot of thought. And I'll just share some of my thoughts that may seem rambling, but I think they might help us. It led me to the question, I think I'm old, as you can tell, and I've been around for a while. And I think we've lost the way. I want to pose the question, why do we have schools? I think that's a question we have to grapple with. And I think people like us in this room and universities, when I hear Senator Elliott talk about trying to get legislation through, there's such a misunderstanding about why we have school, and we got lost in the weeds. I would love to see a national dialogue waged and led by educators. You know how people stormed into senators' offices for health care? We might have to do some of that here around education to force this dialogue. Because for many people, legislators don't pass legislation because they're uninformed and they all have different views about why schools exist. And very often schools exist for certain groups of people for their special interests. So I would like to see waging a national dialogue that involves all areas of the spectrum about why we have schools. Because I think what we've fallen into is that schools become, everybody accepts it's a place we keep kids till they're 16, or it's a place kids go for the day to stay out of trouble, and you get a high school diploma as your rite of passage. But really, what is it, and what metrics do we have? We have a lot of metrics and a lot of data on kids. But I think over the last 60 years, since the Brown versus Board of Education, wouldn't it be lovely to say, agree that in a democracy, we need to be clear about the role of schools in a democracy? And how are we doing? What are some metrics? Is there less racism in the country because of the way we've educated kids for the last 60 years? Are there fewer segregated and marginalized children in schools who we just have to push over the line to get a high school diploma? Is there greater understanding about how we take care of the planet? I think these are the questions we have to grapple with. Otherwise, I feel I've been guilty, as many of you may, that I've helped oil the machine about what schools are, but they missed the mark in terms of that. So I would love to see, that's one thing I would love to see. Some of you have heard me say this before, and I have a very strong view. A second thing is, I think every child's first option, I'm not a big options person, because I think we've had policies of avoidance and alternatives, rather than having the conversation and digging deeply about why some children are failing. Why do we have to do all these extra things we consider them to be for some children? And is it because we're avoiding some of the real issues that surround them? And we tend to see them, children, as the problem versus reflecting back on ourselves. What are the problems we're creating in the way we create schools that make it easier for some children to be successful and others not? and that trend goes on year after year after year. So I would like us to think about developing some metrics about how well schools are doing in fostering the well-being of children across the spectrum, and how well schools are doing in promoting the tenets of democracy. I often think of, and so I'd like to see policies like that, because I think our policies have been, all children are equal, but some are more equal than others. So that's kind of a paraphrasing of Orwell's, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. So when we continue to look at the data that just focuses on children, it will support that over and over again, that some children seem to be more important than others. So I think that I would love to have policy where we begin to examine how schools are perpetuating the kinds of things we're seeing in our climate today. And do we have an educated populace? And do we have people who are able to discern truth-telling? And do we have people who understand the role of science in maintaining the planet? Do we have children who are able to cross borders and have appreciation? And when we talk about language, I can't emphasize it enough, but I do want to include there's another group of English learners, and they are standard English learners. So, and they often get overlooked. And I believe children do not have access to the curriculum unless the language they have is honored, and that that language is used to help them acquire a second language, which is what we call academic English or standard English. But there are a number of children, African American children, who speak a language that's rooted in the syntactical and grammatical structures of West Africa, and they have an English vocabulary, but the syntax and structures are very different, so they can read English words all day long and still not make meaning because of the syntax. We need policies that honor and respect that capital, the language capital that children bring. And so I believe every child, this is a policy I'd love to see in every school district, every child's first option is a school in his or her own community that is providing quality learning experiences, not the avoidance of giving them a choice here or there unless we've taken care of that first option of the child. And that should be a public school that is assessed by standards of excellence that are applicable to schools anywhere. It should be schools that are governed by democratically elected boards and protected from diverting resources to options of which there are never enough for every child to enjoy. So I think that that's a policy I'd love to see. Investing in the community school is essential, and investing in the community where those schools reside. And then another policy that I think is really important is that I'd love to see our schools as sanctuaries, not just from the draconian implementation and laws around immigration, and they're needed there. But I think children who come with differences, come with intellect that goes unrecognized, who come from conditions not because their parents are bad and because communities are bad, but that have been created by policies on healthcare and policies on employment and policies on housing and all of that. We need a national conversation to help our legislators and the public understand that these are not children who come to us broken, but they are children who are experiencing the effects of policies that continue to denigrate them and render them unable to access fully public education. And that's why I believe the community school is so important, that we garner those resources. Because when children's needs, basic needs, are taken care of and they are treated as human beings with dignity, those are children who learn. And that's part of the answer why we can predict test scores by zip code. And so I think schools have to be sanctuaries for children who have been so scarred by oppressions of unemployment in their communities, sanctuaries where relief from segregation and inadequate housing and health care. And if we can garner those, I think it helps us fulfill what our Constitution, our Bill of Rights say, that all men or women, children, people are created equal, that children are not born with deficits, and that when their needs are taken care of and a whole community gathers around and ensures that those needs are met, and that we honor what children bring as assets rather than always looking at them from a deficit perspective, and build on those assets in their communities. Help them respect their own communities and be a part of solving it instead of shipping them away across town somewhere hoping to find nirvana. So I would say that those are policies that I think we really need to give heed to, taking us back to saying, why do we have schools? Who are they for? What are they for? Why do they exist? And how can we really return to Dewey and think about the connection between education and democracy?
Thank you so much. I want to ask the senator a question, but as I do, if any of you have questions yourselves, you can line up at the two microphones on either side of the room. So Dr. Rousseau closed her comments by talking about community schools as a process through which the community gathers around the school and to support it. I'm wondering if that also represents a metaphor for policy and policy making, in the sense that we need to have radical participation across many different sectors, and if you can speak to what that looks like in order to advance some of these policies.
Well, I'll start with the given that, okay, so we're going to have politics, so that's going to be there, so how do you make it better, and how do you have that radical participation? And just for me, one of the things that really galls me more than anything else are people who come with these great policies talking about a zip code. Every time we romanticize this notion that because I want to be a good person, I don't really know much about education, and I want to look as if I'm doing something without really having to upset my apple cart. So we talk about a kid's zip code, that no child should have to be a victim of the zip code, so you should have the choice to move from a school in your zip code. Well, my thing about that is then you are concentrating on the wrong thing. Concentrate on helping us change the damn zip code, not making the child having to go someplace else and then say we've done something fantastic. Well, the reason something like that has prevailed and caught on around this nation is that we have not had radical participation. And I cannot begin to even think about how that's going to happen, how that kind of thinking is going to change, unless we do discomfort ourselves and inconvenience ourselves to be in that arena. Maybe it would be a great thing if we woke up tomorrow and there were no more legislators in some people's minds wreaking havoc on school districts. But that's not going to happen until somebody is there to fill in the gap to say, no, this is not the way to do it. And as an educator, I have all kind of cred showing up as an educator. But I also sit there as a politician. And if people who are still out there, and this is the one thing that you are doing for the most part, if you show up, bring parents with you, bring students with you, or something even more radical, every legislator lives in some community somewhere. They're not your legislator unless they live in your district. You ought to require legislators to come and speak and talk to you and talk to parents, not always going to the legislator's turf at the Capitol. That's a good thing. But the folks right now doing something with this thing called, indivisible, you might have paid some attention to. They're not waiting to go to legislators' offices. They are demanding that in their community, where the metaphor really could be lived out, that we are going to hold our meetings, our talks, our conferences, and have you accountable to me in my community so all the community people can show up. And we don't demand this. And what's read by that, when we don't demand it, people start to think they're doing the right thing. I cannot emphasize to you enough that everybody is not doing this just because they want us to be upset. There are some people, of course, have great lobbyists, they have big money informing what they're doing. Lord knows, I live in the land of Walmart. That is where the headquarters is. So when I talk about how money and how power are influencing education and taking it away from what it should be, I have to say it right across the table from some of the very people who are funding what I think are going off the rails and keeping it off the rails. But I can't do it alone. And it is a great thing. Many times we will have a conference, but more than anything else, I know how this works back in our schools. We will have a conversation in the teacher's lounge, or if you have an office or whatever, and that feels all great, and then nothing happens because of it. And the kids are suffering because adults are not standing in the gap. We just have to have more adults standing in the gap and giving people the right information and demanding more. And they look for us not to, and when we don't, we get what we've gotten. And I think that, I said it earlier, but I really do mean this. There's nothing that prepares you to be in politics better than being a teacher. Because you have to deal with all kind of people all the time, figure out a different message from one child to 25 or 30 all the time. And you have to say things over and over and over and over and hope somebody's listening. Therefore, you have the patience of Job, most of you, if you've made it. And these are skills that are very helpful in politics, but you have to lead back in your communities, I think, is the bottom line.
Dr. Kirp, did you want
I just wanted two quick anecdotes in support of what the senator was just saying. In Texas, a congressional district was gerrymandered to get rid of a liberal congressman. I drove that district. It's a little string bean that sort of ran from George Bush's ranch down to the other Bush's public policy school. It's about 8 miles wide and 130 miles long, and it had 70% Republicans in it. Well, the Democrat won. How did the Democrat win? Because the candidate handpicked by Karl Rove to beat this guy, her big boast was, I cut millions and millions of dollars out of the children's insurance fund so we can save money. And the TV ad ran, is a mom with a daughter on her lap, and she says, I've got a good job now. I'm a widow. My husband died in Iraq. If I lose that job, I don't know what I'm going to do. So when you ask the voters when they left, what moved them, 15% of those voters were Democrats for a day because of just that one moment. And let me tell you, the Texas legislature never gets called in a special session except for things like the bathroom bill. Called in a special session, what bill did they pass? They restored that money for CHIP. A shorter story. In Chicago, the community groups are really well organized around early education. The bunches of they fight behind closed doors. They come out, here's our priority. We're going to do this. And every year they bus thousands of parents down to Springfield to do exactly what you're talking about. And one woman talks to her state representative and says, Senator, how do we get more money for early education? And he said, ma'am, I wish I could have an answer, but I just don't know how. And she said, how can we elect somebody who does know how? Those are the parents that you want. Politicians are enormously risk-averse folks. You defeat a couple of them because they're bad to kids. Yeah. Life is going to change a whole lot for the better.
Right.
Terrific. Let's go to our first questioner.
Hi, this is perhaps a drill down on Professor Rogers' last question, although it pulls a bit of a thread from what you just mentioned about gerrymandering. Actually, anybody on the panel, I would be interested to know what you would say to what I'm about to ask, but if I may direct it to Dr. Rousseau. On the theme of community school, I'm wondering what strategies you recommend or let's say also, aside from strategies, what priorities you see to take steps towards desegregation of the community schools that we are envisioning, particularly in places where, at the elementary level at least, we're talking about a neighborhood which is most likely a segregated community. What strategies and what priorities can you articulate for us to ensure that our community schools can be not segregated or can become desegregated?
A couple of things. So one, you're looking at long range, and number two, segregation isn't always between people of color and white people. But one of the things that I believe we need to do in community schools is that we very often have middle-class people leaving community schools looking for something over the horizon as a better place to be. So we need an integration within communities so that the whole community embraces. John talks about, Dr. Rogers, about being at Santa Monica. That school is the flagship for the whole community. And so I think that that's one thing. Integration and crossing borders. We find many of our schools now are heavily African American and Latino. There's a lot of work to do on desegregation right there. So that we don't define integration or desegregation by the presence, as we have historically, of only white people need to be present. And then the second piece is good schools lead to good communities, and good communities lead to good schools. And over time, the best strategy is to invest in those community schools, access the resources, treat the communities with respect, and draw upon their funds of knowledge. And the best strategy is to make that a great school, because people will come running back to that school. That's, I think, the best way to try to promote it.
Dr. Garcia, I know you wanted to weigh in.
I'm assuming that your school has children who come to school whose primary language is not English. And I could say 3 priorities which already exist within present federal policy under Title I, which are not being used presently and likely not at your school. We know that early childhood education is going to help them do well at 3rd and 5th grade. Yet Title I monies utilized for early childhood are less than 6%. So we're not using what we already have the capability to use. We're not touching it. Supporting teachers specifically to address the needs of English learners. 50% of the money in Title I can go for that in those schools that have it, and it does not. It goes to literacy, math, science, but not to support teachers who specifically are working with English learners. Family engagement is now allowable under Title I. It is federal policy. You can use money coming directly to your school to engage families. Not happening. Not happening. So I'd say those are priorities for English learners, family engagement, teacher support, and early childhood. And it's not being done now under present policy circumstances.
I would just add another thing. A lot of the money goes to remediation and intervention, as if these children are just deficit-laden, versus good professional development. I'm going to add standard English learners too, because as you see the literacy data separate, we find African American children have no sustained systemic way of transitioning or adding English, academic English, as their second language. So they're being asked to be literate in a language no one has helped them develop. But I do believe that there's so much emphasis on intervention and remediation rather than helping students access rigor and widening those opportunities. And if the school, we had integration with people who went all across town to go to schools and so-called integrate, wasn't because they necessarily wanted to sit next to a white child, but they wanted to access a good education. So our job is in wherever the community is, wherever the school, make it excellent. That will draw people.
So it's now the case that community schools can be funded under Title I. And that it's the very same issue that Gene is raising. It's not going to happen unless there are folks pushing for it. None of this is going to happen unless there are folks pushing for it at the local, at the district level. That's where it counts, at the school board and with the school administration.
But I see a long-range issue here. Our neighborhoods became the way they are in so many ways because of housing policies. And from your question, I assume that it's important to you, as it is for everybody, for our schools to be integrated, whether it's race, economics, language, or whatever. But a lot of this, I think a big problem we have when it comes to the policy side of things, where legislators are in charge. I'm really trying to get our legislature to think about no longer trying to address the issues we have in education just in the education committee. Because in politics, we don't practice that metaphor that you talk about. We know all of these things like housing, transportation, health issues, and the other legislators, I'll keep saying this to you, are willing for that to be dumped on the 5 or 6 people who sit on the education committee. Those issues are never going to be solved in the education committee. So long range, what I wish we would think about, and then include ourselves, because we're not practicing what we preach when we say we want our schools to be places of democracy where kids learn to be around all kind of kids different from them. And then if we live in a neighborhood that does not look like that, and too many of us do. So there needs to be some kind of discussion when we're talking about this education discussion. What are we doing as a people to make our democracy what it should be by not running away from each other, by taking deliberate steps to live in a neighborhood where not everybody looks like you? These are things we can do and not just keep pointing at somebody else to do, but we have to work for it and not act as if for some reason, and I hear this all the time, particularly from my white friends, my kid is not going to be an experiment. I'm not going to move, as if it's okay if somebody else's child is an experiment or something. But these are the kind of questions we need to ask our personal selves. Are we okay with the schools being segregated? We must be if we choose not to live and take deliberative acts to do something about it by where we live, who our friends are. Because when it's unacceptable, we'll do something about it. But if it's acceptable, then, you know, we let the status quo sit.
So thank you, Senator Elliott, and our entire panel. I think we saw in these final comments that as we begin to push back against policy, it calls upon us to double down on democracy and to think about how we can revitalize our civic life in a way that's more inclusive and respectful and participatory. Let's all thank our panel.